Have you ever felt on the edge of something you couldn't name, as if there were an invisible abyss right in front of you? A strange feeling, a silence that isn't peace, but a warning. Picture this. It's night. No stars. You're walking down an empty road, each step echoing louder than the last. Around you, nothing answers, and inside, something begins to stir, as if your soul is whispering what your mind keeps trying to ignore. Have you felt that? That formless unease, hiding between repetitive thoughts, impulsive choices, and that deep exhaustion, not of the body, but of the soul. Ever noticed how it feels like you're about to fall, even when everything seems perfectly in place? What if I told you that feeling is real, that your unconscious is already trying to warn you before the fall? Carl Jung, the psychiatrist who dared to dive into the human soul, believed the unconscious isn't just a storage room of repressed memories. To him, it's a living intelligence, symbolic, deep. And often, prophetic, it sends signals, dreams, symptoms, impulses. It whispers truths that reason tries to silence, but when we don't listen, it screams. And then we fall. Today, we're stepping into that dark and fascinating territory. We'll explore the invisible signs that appear before collapse, the warnings of a weary soul, the messages from the shadow, lurking at the edges of your awareness, and how Jung and existential thought saw these moments not as the end, but as the possible beginning, because sometimes falling is the only way to awaken, and maybe, just maybe, what you're feeling right now, deep in your chest, isn't weakness. It's the first call of your transformation. The fall doesn't begin with a crash. It begins with a tiredness you can't explain, with a lightness that slowly vanishes from your body, with a joy that fades for no reason. It starts as a vague discomfort, something you feel but can't quite name, like a fog, slowly settling in until it covers everything. This is the first lie of the fall. It seems small, but that's exactly when it's most dangerous. You wake up and everything looks the same. But inside, something has shifted. Quiet disconnection begins to grow between what you live and what you actually feel, and in that empty space, the unconscious steps in. For Carl Jung, the unconscious is a silent intelligence, hidden, symbolic, alive. It's not your enemy. It's a part of you that knows. It knows what you've ignored, what you didn't want to feel, what you locked away in your soul out of fear of falling apart. And when you refuse to listen to yourself, it's the unconscious that starts to scream from within. But the scream of the unconscious doesn't use words. It hides, as insomnia, because something inside you refuses to rest, as anxiety, because what's been repressed is starting to stir, as anger, because parts of you are tired of being denied, as boredom, because the path you chose might no longer be yours, as self-sabotage, because the unconscious would rather destroy a false life than let you keep living a lie. Jung believed the unconscious doesn't work against us. In fact, it's a guide, but a guide that speaks in symbols, and one we often only understand when we're already on the ground. The fall we feel, that invisible spiral pulling us down, is a signal, an unspoken invitation, a desperate attempt by the unconscious to bring us back to the center. But what causes us to fall? The shadow. The shadow for Jung is everything we reject in ourselves, our weaknesses, desires, shame, trauma, instincts, memories, everything we were taught we shouldn't be, but still are. The shadow is not evil. It's what was forgotten, what was judged, what was locked away in the basement of the soul, and it doesn't disappear. It waits, and when life starts pulling us away from who we truly are, it begins to speak. But It doesn't ask nicely, it demands. It shows up in our actions, in our choices, in our relationships. You repeat patterns you swore you'd never repeat. You attract people who trigger your deepest wounds. You get lost in distractions, addictions, cycles that loop endlessly. And you wonder, why do I always end up in this place? Because the shadow is trying to be seen. The unconscious sends signs, but the ego, distracted, ignores them. It wants to keep functioning, producing, pretending, protecting the image. But the unconscious doesn't care about image. It cares about truth. And if the truth is buried, it digs. That is the fall. The collapse of what's false, the unveiling of what's been denied for too long. But not all is lost, Jung said. What we do not face in the unconscious ends up manifesting in our fate. In other words, if you don't face what's inside you, your life will start to reflect it on the outside. The fall, then, is a warning. Before its destruction, it's an invitation, a call to stop, look, feel, listen. It's the moment when the soul says enough, enough of autopilot, enough of ignoring the pain, enough of running from yourself. This is when the inner hero awakens, not the hero from epic tales, but the quiet one, the one brave enough to enter the dark. Jung called this the individuation process, the path back to wholeness, the encounter with the shadow, not to destroy it, but to integrate it. The true fall, according to Jung, doesn't happen when you fail. It happens when you lose yourself, when you live a life that isn't yours, when you go silent out of fear, when you pretend out of habit. But there is a way out. Listen to what the unconscious is trying to say. Look at what hurts before the pain becomes your fate. The fall is inevitable at some point in life, but it can be the beginning of something new if you have the courage to look within and finally see what's always been there. There's a moment when silence becomes unbearable, not the silence of the world outside, but the one inside, the one that echoes in your chest like an absence, an unnamed void. It's in this place that existential philosophers dwelled, and perhaps without realizing it, you have too. Nietzsche offers us a frame. Without a mirror, God is dead. But what did he really mean by this? It's not an attack on faith. It's a warning that when we abandon external structures, the certainties, the traditions, the inherited illusions, what remains is only you, alone before the infinite. And then the fall begins, not because the world ended, but because now you must create your own meaning. And this task, to create meaning in an indifferent universe, is overwhelming. Nietzsche called this nihilism, the moment when all values become relative, when the ground dissolves and everything seemed absurd. But he didn't stop there. He also gave us an exit, the Übermensch, the being who transforms the pain of the fall into creation, who dances upon the abyss, who affirms life even in the face of chaos. The fall, for Nietzsche, is inevitable, but it is also the cradle of possibility. Indeed, while Nietzsche was shouting to the world, Kierkegaard whispered to the soul. He spoke of despair, but not the ordinary despair. It was the deepest despair, the despair of being disconnected from who you are. Imagine wearing a mask for so long that you forget who's behind it. That's despair. According to Kierkegaard, most people live like this, running from themselves, denying their essence, avoiding the confrontation with their own freedom. Because being truly free isn't romantic, it's frightening. Freedom demands choices, courage, responsibility. And despair arises when we try to avoid this responsibility, when we prefer to live by others' expectations or by the roles we've been given instead of confronting the anguish of being authentic. The fall for Kierkegaard is not the end. It's the beginning. It's the brutal awakening that forces us to ask, who am I, beyond what I've been told I am? If Nietzsche is the rebel, and Kierkegaard the mystic, Schopenhauer, Idri the lucid pessimist, for him, life is suffering just like that, not out of divine cruelty, but because we are driven by a blind will, an irrational impulse that pushes us forward, even when we don't know where to go. Have you ever felt that? A force inside you, an insatiable desire, a restlessness that doesn't quiet, a hunger that can never be satisfied. That's the will, and it's deaf to reason. It just wants. It wants to possess, to conquer, to avoid the void. But the more we feed this will, the more we suffer, because it's never satisfied. The fall, for Schopenhauer, is surrendering to this cycle. Desire, frustration, and never escaping. The exit, it's not in success or conquest, it's in renunciation, in contemplation, in elevating consciousness, above wanting. A difficult path, but possible. Jung, though a psychologist, was a philosopher of the soul. And he didn't ignore these abysses described by Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Schopenhauer. On the contrary, he integrated them. For Jung, the unconscious pushes us to fall, not to destroy us, but to awaken us. Indeed, he saw Nietzsche's nihilism as the beginning of the individuation process, the moment when old values die and a new self begins to emerge. He would agree with Kierkegaard that despair comes from disconnection with the true self, and that healing is reconciliation with that hidden essence. And like Schopenhauer, Jung understood that we are driven by unconscious forces, wills, impulses, archetypes that operate behind our apparent reason. But Jung offered something more, the possibility of integration. It's not about eliminating the abyss, but descending into it and returning with something new. It's the myth of the descent to the underworld. It's Orpheus, it's Dante, it's you. You being called to look within, to face your own dark night and emerge more whole. Still broken, still human, but now conscious. So perhaps the fall is not a mistake, but a calling, a brutal invitation to freedom, to truth, to responsibility. And as existentialists say, there's no escaping the abyss, but there's a way to choose how to fall. And perhaps, just perhaps, you are not falling. You are finally waking up. Say, have you ever felt like something is about to collapse, but you don't know exactly what? It's like a fog takes over your mind, and behind it, a silent, persistent presence. One that doesn't scream, but whispers. These whispers come from a place we cannot control, the unconscious. Don't expect clarity. The unconscious doesn't send warnings with words. It communicates in symbols, in symptoms, in silent omens. At first, everything seems small, an insomnia that arises without reason, a fatigue that doesn't go away, even after rest, an anxiety that cannot name what it fears. But these signs, they are not random. They are beacons lit in the dark, trying to prevent an internal collision. Carl Jung said, the unconscious always tries to compensate. In other words, it reacts when we stray too far from who we are. When we betray our essence, it moves to bring us back. But it does so in its own way, symbolic, fragmented, and often painful. Anxiety, compulsion, loss of control. These are not flaws to be fixed. They are coded messages. When the soul begins to crack, the body screams what the mind cannot formulate. You feel tightness in your chest, restless sleep, the impulse to escape without knowing from what You feel an anger that appears without context, a sadness that has no justification, and you begin to distrust yourself. But what if, instead of silencing it all, you listened? What if each symptom is actually a desperate attempt by the unconscious to avoid the fall? Projections. This is another way the unconscious reveals itself. Jung said, "What we do not accept in ourselves, we project onto others. We begin to see monsters outside because we cannot bear to look inside. And then, without realizing it, we live external wars that are merely reflections of internal battles." Have you ever hated someone with strange intensity? Have you ever been bothered by others' actions that, if you were honest, also existed in you? This is the projected shadow. It's the unconscious saying, "Face. This is yours." And the more we resist, the closer the fall becomes, because denying the shadow is giving it the power to destroy us without warning. Archetypes emerge when everything begins to crumble. Jung spoke of them as primordial forces of the psyche. They are not inventions, they are living structures within us. And in times of crisis, one of them tends to awaken: the hero. But the hero doesn't emerge strong. He appears when the fall is inevitable, and only then does he realize he must face the inner monster. This monster, of course, is symbolic. It is the pain we avoid, the guilt we bury, the fear we suppress. It is everything we didn't want to look at, and now demands to be faced. The hero only survives if he crosses this abyss. And this abyss, before being the world, is the very soul. The unconscious is older than you, older than your personal story. Into it carries myths, symbols, archetypes, everything humanity has learned and forgotten. That's why it speaks a language logic cannot comprehend. But the heart feels it, and the body translates it. You need to learn to listen with another, in part of yourself, not with the analyzing mind, but with the soul that intuits. As the danger is not in the fall, it's in ignoring the signs. It's not the abyss that destroys. It's the fact that you continue walking toward it, with your eyes closed. And you, what signs have you ignored? When the abyss seems imminent, when the signs from the unconscious become impossible to ignore, a crucial choice arises. It's a choice between the final fall or recovery. Recovery is not something simple. It is not a return to the starting point, but a deep transformation, a rebirth of the self, which only becomes possible when you allow yourself to listen to the call of the unconscious. But what is necessary to avoid the total fall? The first step is becoming conscious. And here, the word consciousness does not merely refer to the superficial awareness of what happens around us. To speak of consciousness in Jung's context is to dive deep into our own psyche. Consciousness is the ability to recognize the forces at play within us, even those we prefer to avoid. It is seeing the sign and understanding that they are not obstacles to be overcome, but messages to be understood. The unconscious, which once tried to call our attention through whispers and small discomforts, now becomes clearer. It doesn't want us trapped in a cycle of pain and suffering. The unconscious wants us whole, aware of our totality. And to reach this totality, we must integrate the parts of ourselves that were hidden in the shadows. Only when we allow ourselves to look at those parts, when we stop running from them, can we begin to heal. But this requires courage. Courage to face what is hidden within us, courage to accept ourselves as we are, with all our flaws, shadows, and vulnerabilities. The integration of the shadow is not an easy process. It is a path of deconstruction where old beliefs and masks are shattered, and the deepest truths about ourselves come to the surface. Transformation does not happen overnight. It is not an immediate solution. It is a journey that requires patience and persistence. As you begin to integrate your shadow, you will find moments of peace and balance, but also moments of discomfort. Because true recovery is not the absence of pain, but the ability to live fully with all the emotions and experiences life offers us. On the other hand, the final fall occurs when we ignore the call, when we resist the process of self-knowledge and prefer to remain in the comfort zone of ignorance. The fall then is not a surprise, but the inevitable result of our choice to not listen to the signs from the unconscious. It is an internal collapse that reflects in our relationships, our mental health, and our perception of who we are. The final fall is not something that happens suddenly. It is a downward spiral where we continuously drift further from our essence and our inner truth. Recovery is possible, but it requires a commitment to the process. It demands that you look inside yourself, that you confront your shadows, that you allow yourself to grow and evolve. And above all, it requires that you accept that life is not about avoiding the fall, but about learning to rise when it happens. You can choose recovery. You can choose to face your own shadow, to listen to the signs from the unconscious, and through this journey, find true freedom. Freedom not from being perfect, but from being whole, an integrated being who embraces both the light and the darkness within themselves. This is how we avoid the final fall, with courage, with consciousness, and with the acceptance that the true path ahead is the one we walk through ourselves. Throughout this journey, we've explored the signs of the unconscious, those silent and profound warnings that, if ignored, can lead us to the fall. These signs are always present, yet we often choose to ignore them. However, true power does not lie in avoiding the fall, but in learning from it. In listening to the messages the unconscious is trying to send us, and using this knowledge to elevate ourselves. Carl Jung offers us a key to this, the integration of the shadow. When we look within, when we face what we've hidden from ourselves, we can become more whole, more complete. True transformation comes when we accept that we are made of both light and darkness, and that both parts are essential for our evolution. I ask you now, as we finalize this reflection, have you listened to the signs of your unconscious? What has it been trying to show you, and why have you avoided looking at it? These questions are not easy to answer, but they are fundamental to your path. The journey of self-knowledge is ongoing, but it begins the moment you decide to listen. What will you do with these signs that you are now more aware of perceiving? Will you continue ignoring them? Or will you open yourself to what the unconscious has to reveal? The choice is in your hands. Now is the moment to reflect, to dive deep into your own being, to explore what your unconscious has been trying to show you. There are no easy answers, but the inner search, the deep self-knowledge, will always be the most transformative path. If this reflection has touched you, and you wish to continue this journey of self-discovery, subscribe to the channel now. Here we will explore together the deeper layers of the human psyche, unveil the shadows, and learn to listen to what our unconscious has to say. Don't miss the next videos. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your journey begins here.